The sacred grove of the Veltar pack hummed with ancient magic as hundreds of werewolves gathered under the full moon for the awakening ceremony. Tonight, the spirits of their ancestors would reveal the fated bonds that connected souls across bloodlines and status, determining partnerships that would shape the future of their people. Eyris Veltar stood among the unmated wolves, his heart beating rapidly as he tried to calm the nervous energy that coursed through his slender frame. As an omega from one of the lower branches of the Veltar bloodline, Eyris had always known his place in the rigid hierarchy that governed pack life. His strength lay not in physical prowess or dominance, but in intuition and sensitivity, gifts that were often overlooked in a society that valued power above all else. His ability to sense emotions and read the subtle currents of feeling that flowed beneath social interactions had made him valuable as a mediator and counselor, but it had also marked him as different, perhaps even weak, in the eyes of those who measured worth by the ability to fight and command. The ceremonial fires cast dancing shadows across the faces of the gathered wolves, and Eyris could feel the complex mix of emotions radiating from the crowd like heat from the flames themselves. Excitement, fear, desperate hope, and underneath it all, the primal anticipation that came with the possibility of discovering one's destined mate. His own family stood in their designated area among the lesser nobles, their pride in him tempered by realistic expectations about what kind of match an omega of his standing might attract. At the center of the ceremony stood Kenrigar, the pack's alpha and heir to the most powerful bloodline in their territory. Everything about him spoke of dominance and authority, from his imposing height to the way other wolves instinctively lowered their eyes when he passed. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and predatory beauty that spoke of generations of alpha genetics refined through selective breeding. When he moved, it was with the fluid confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted, and his steel-gray eyes held the cold calculation of a born leader who saw other beings primarily as assets to be managed or obstacles to be overcome. The pack's high shaman raised her staff, and the assembled wolves fell silent as one. Tonight, under the blessing of the blood moon, the spirits of our ancestors will reveal the bonds that tie soul to soul across the barriers of flesh and circumstance. Let no wolf question what the ancient magic reveals, for the wisdom of the dead transcends the understanding of the living. Her voice carried across the grove with the authority of centuries, and Eyris felt something deep inside his chest begin to sing with recognition and anticipation. The ritual began with the lighting of the spirit fire, a blaze that burned with ethereal blue flames and smoke that seemed to move with purpose rather than following the natural patterns of wind and air. As the sacred herbs were added to the flames, the smoke began to swirl and dance, forming patterns that spoke to senses beyond the physical, revealing connections that existed in the realm of spirit and destiny. Eyris watched in fascination as couples throughout the grove began to glow with the soft silver light that marked true bonds. Young wolves who had grown up together discovered they were meant to be lifelong companions. Warriors found their matches in healers whose gentle natures would balance their aggressive instincts. One by one, pairs stepped forward to have their connections blessed by the elders and witnessed by the pack. It was when the ceremony seemed nearly complete, when most of the unmated wolves had either found their partners or resigned themselves to waiting for another season, that the spirit fire suddenly flared with blinding intensity. The flames shot high into the night sky, and the smoke began to form patterns more complex and dramatic than anything the pack had ever witnessed. The ghostly image that emerged from the sacred flames was unmistakable. Two wolves standing side by side, one large and dominant, the other smaller but somehow luminous with its own inner light. Golden threads connected them at heart and spirit, and the ancestors' voices whispered through the smoke with a message that sent shockwaves through the assembled pack. Eyris felt the pull before he consciously understood what was happening. His body began to move without his conscious direction, drawn by forces older than civilization itself toward the center of the grove. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized where the spiritual current was leading him, what impossible truth the ancestors were revealing. Kenrigar stood frozen in the center of the ceremonial circle, his face cycling through emotions too rapid and complex to identify. Disbelief, anger, confusion, and underneath it all, a recognition that he couldn't deny no matter how much he might want to. The golden threads that connected them were visible to every wolf present, blazing with a light that grew stronger as they drew closer together. "No," Ken said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "This is impossible. The spirits have made an error." But the high shaman was already moving forward, her ancient face alight with wonder and reverence. "The ancestors do not make errors, Alpha Can. What you see before you is the will of the moon goddess herself, a bond that transcends the artificial boundaries we have created in our mortal ignorance. I will not bind my name to a worthless omega," Ken declared, his voice rising to carry across the entire grove. "Do not mistake fate for a mockery of nature. This creature is nothing, a weakling who would only diminish the strength of our bloodline." The words hit Eyris like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. Through the bond that was trying to form between them, he could feel Ken's genuine revulsion, his shame at being connected to someone the Alpha saw as fundamentally beneath him. The beautiful golden light that had connected them began to flicker and fade as Ken deliberately fought against the connection, pouring his will and his rejection into severing what the spirits had revealed. "I reject this bond," Ken announced with ceremonial finality, raising his hands and speaking the ancient words that would break what the ancestors had forged. "I cast aside this false connection and declare myself free of any obligation to this mistake of destiny." The spiritual violence of the rejection was unlike anything Eyris had ever experienced. It felt like having his soul torn in half, like losing some essential part of himself that he hadn't even known existed until it was ripped away. He collapsed to his knees in the center of the grove, gasping for air as waves of pain and loss crashed over him with relentless intensity. The laughter started then, first from Can's closest followers, then spreading through the crowd like a contagion of cruelty. Wolves who had known him all his life now looked at him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust, as if his rejection had somehow contaminated him with failure. "Look at the mighty fated mate," one of the Alpha's companions jeered. "Can't even stand on his own four paws after being properly put in his place. Maybe the moon goddess was testing our Alpha's wisdom," another added, and the laughter grew louder, more vicious. "Seeing if he was strong enough to reject weakness even when it came wrapped in pretty spiritual packaging." Eyris knelt in the center of the circle, his body shaking with the aftershocks of the broken bond, while hundreds of his packmates witnessed his humiliation. He could see his own family in the crowd, their faces flushed with embarrassment and disappointment. His parents looked like they wanted to disappear, to somehow distance themselves from the son who had brought such shame upon their lineage. "Remove him from the sacred grove," Ken commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an Alpha whose word was law. "This mockery has gone on long enough." The pack enforcers moved forward to drag Eyris away, but the high shaman raised her staff to stop them. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from speaking for the spirits themselves. "The ancestors' message is not yet complete." The spirit fire flared again, and new images began to form in the smoke. Eyris, through his pain and humiliation, caught glimpses of what the spirits were showing. A great wolf standing alone in darkness, surrounded by creatures of shadow and blood. Other images flashed by too quickly to interpret fully, but he sensed themes of exile, loss, and eventually, a kind of redemption that came through choosing love over duty, heart over tradition. "The spirits say this rejection will lead to a greater awakening," the high shaman translated, her voice heavy with prophetic weight, "that sometimes what seems like an ending is actually a beginning, and that the goddess's plans extend far beyond our limited understanding." "Enough mystical nonsense," Ken snapped, his patience clearly exhausted. "I want this creature removed from my sight and from my territory. Let him wander the wild lands and contemplate the folly of reaching above his station." The formal exile that followed was swift and brutal. Eyris was stripped of his family name, his pack membership, and his right to shelter or protection within their territory. His few possessions were thrown into a travel sack, and he was escorted to the boundary markers by guards who seemed to take satisfaction in his fall from grace. "You have until sunrise to be beyond our borders," the lead guard informed him with casual cruelty. After that, you'll be considered a trespasser and dealt with accordingly. Eyris walked through the night in a haze of pain and disbelief, his rejected bond burning in his chest like an unhealed wound. The forest beyond pack territory was dark and dangerous, filled with creatures that hunted lone wolves and worse things that were drawn to the scent of despair and abandonment. He had been walking for hours when he heard the howls behind him, the hunting cries of young alphas who had decided that his humiliation was entertainment worth pursuing. These were the sons of prominent families, wolves who had grown up believing that their strength gave them the right to torment anyone weaker than themselves. "There he is," one of them called out as they crashed through the underbrush in pursuit. The great rejected Omega, wandering the woods like the worthless stray he always was. "I bet he's crying," another added with vicious amusement, probably wondering how he ever thought he was worthy of a real alpha's attention. They caught up with him in a clearing beside a fast-moving stream, 5 young wolves in their prime who surrounded him like predators circling wounded prey. Eyris tried to run, but his exhaustion and emotional trauma had left him weak and clumsy. They brought him down easily, laughing as he struggled beneath their combined weight. "Let's give him something to really cry about," their leader suggested, his hands already moving toward Eyris's clothes with intentions that made the Omega's blood run cold with terror. But before they could complete their assault, something changed in the atmosphere around them. The temperature seemed to drop by degrees, and shadows began to move with purpose rather than following natural patterns of light and darkness. The stream beside them began to run red, though none of them could identify the source of the blood that now colored the water. "What's happening?" one of the young alphas whispered, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear as he looked around at the unnatural phenomena surrounding them. "We should go," another suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong here. The forest feels wrong." But it was too late for retreat. Dark figures emerged from the shadows between the trees, moving with inhuman grace and speed that spoke of predators far more dangerous than any werewolf. Their leader stepped into the moonlight, revealing features that were beautiful in an otherworldly way, all sharp angles and pale perfection that immediately marked him as something other than human. "Gentlemen," the vampire said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had learned to speak when language itself was young, "I do hope you're not planning to damage my recent purchase." The young wolves scattered like leaves before a hurricane, their courage evaporating in the face of creatures that saw werewolves as just another form of prey. Within moments, Eyris found himself alone in the clearing with beings whose very presence made his instincts scream warnings about predators that existed at the top of the supernatural food chain. "Purchase," Eyris managed to whisper, his voice hoarse from the night's trauma. "Indeed," the vampire replied, approaching with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered anything he couldn't handle. "You were sold at auction 3 hours ago to settle certain debts incurred by your former pack's gambling habits. I am Ravin Mortis, and you now belong to me." The revelation that his own pack had sold him like livestock to cover their financial obligations was almost more devastating than the original rejection. Eyris felt whatever remaining hope he had carried begin to crumble into dust and despair. "I don't consume omegas," Ravin continued, his tone conversational despite the horrifying implications of his words. "Your kind has an unusual taste that I find unappetizing. But you may prove useful in other ways, provided you can follow simple instructions and avoid causing unnecessary complications." Eyris found himself transported to a manor house that seemed to exist outside the normal world, a place where shadows moved independently of their sources and rooms seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was looking directly at them. The architecture was ancient and elegant, all soaring ceilings and graceful arches that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. His quarters were surprisingly comfortable, a suite of rooms that included a bedroom, a sitting area, and access to a private bathroom with running water that seemed like impossible luxury after his night in the wilderness. The clothes provided for him were well-made but practical, marking him clearly as household staff rather than a prisoner, though he understood that the distinction was largely semantic. When he was finally brought before Ravin in the vampire's private study, Eyris found himself in a room that was part library, part laboratory and part museum. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their bindings suggesting volumes in dozens of languages spanning centuries of accumulated knowledge. Artifacts and curiosities filled every available surface, each one radiating its own unique magical signature. "You will serve as my research assistant and general aide," Ravin explained without preamble, his tone suggesting that refusal wasn't an option. "Your duties will include maintaining my correspondence, organizing research materials, and providing assistance with various projects that require a delicate touch." "And if I refuse?" Eyris asked, though he already knew the question was pointless. "Then you'll be sold to someone with less refined tastes," Ravin replied matter-of-factly. "I understand there's quite a market for rejected omegas in certain circles where their damaged state is considered an appealing feature." The choice, such as it was obvious. Eyris nodded his acceptance, and something that might have been approval flickered in Ravin's dark eyes. "Excellent. You'll find that I'm a reasonable master, provided you remember your place and perform your duties competently. You're free to move about the manor as your work requires, though I should mention that attempting to leave the grounds is generally fatal for those who haven't been properly attuned to the estate's protective wards." The routine that followed was surprisingly manageable. Eyris's duties were exactly as Ravin had described, organizing the vampire's vast collection of books and artifacts, maintaining correspondence with contacts across the supernatural world, and assisting with research projects that ranged from historical investigation to experimental magic. The vampire himself was a contradiction that Eyris found increasingly intriguing. Ravin could be casually cruel one moment and unexpectedly considerate the next, his moods shifting like shadows cast by flickering candlelight. He never raised his voice or made overt threats, but his very presence carried an aura of contained danger that made even the boldest servants speak in whispers when he passed. What surprised Eyris most was how Ravin treated him with a kind of distant respect that he had never experienced before. The vampire addressed him by name rather than as Omega or servant, asked for his opinions on various matters, and seemed genuinely interested in his insights on the emotional and psychological aspects of the beings they studied. "Your perspective is valuable," Ravin told him one evening as they worked together on translating an ancient text. "Most of my associates view emotions as weaknesses to be exploited rather than forces to be understood. Your sensitivity provides insights that pure intellect cannot achieve." "You don't see my empathy as weakness?" Eyris asked, genuinely surprised by the assessment. "Weakness is the inability to use the tools available to you," Ravin replied thoughtfully. "Your empathy is a tool, just as my supernatural speed is a tool, or my centuries of accumulated knowledge. The key is learning to wield it effectively rather than letting it control you." It was during one of the fierce storms that periodically swept through the region that their relationship began to shift into something more complex than master and servant. Eyris had been organizing files in the library when he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of a child crying somewhere in the depths of the manor. Following the sound through corridors he had never explored before, Eyris found himself in what appeared to be a dungeon, complete with cells and restraints that spoke of the building's darker uses. In one of the cells, he discovered a small figure huddled in the corner, a child who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The boy was clearly a werewolf, his scent carrying the distinctive markers of Eyris's own kind, but he had been injured and traumatized to the point where he could barely speak coherently. His clothes were torn and bloody, and his eyes held the kind of terror that spoke of experiences no child should ever endure. "Hey there," Eyris said softly, approaching the cell with the same careful movements he would use with any frightened animal. "My name is Eyris. What's yours?" "Lynn," the boy whispered, looking up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "Are you going to hurt me too?" "No," Eyris said firmly, his heart breaking at the question. "I'm not going to hurt you, but I need to get you out of here and make sure you're safe." The cell wasn't locked, suggesting that the boy had been too injured or traumatized to attempt escape. Eyris gathered him up carefully, noting the way Lynn flinched at first contact before gradually relaxing into the embrace of someone who radiated safety rather than threat. It was as he was carrying the boy through the manor's corridors that Ravin appeared. his dark eyes taking in the situation with the swift assessment of someone accustomed to processing complex information rapidly. "Explain," the vampire said, his tone neutral but carrying undertones that suggested consequences for the wrong answer. "I found him in the dungeons," Eyris replied, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "He's been hurt, traumatized. He needs medical attention and care, not imprisonment. He's werewolf spawn taken during a raid on a pack that defaulted on certain obligations," Ravin said matter-of-factly. "He was intended as merchandise for clients with specific tastes." The casual way Ravin discussed the child's fate, as if he were talking about any other business transaction, made Eyris' stomach turn with revulsion and anger. "He's a child," he said, his voice rising despite his attempts to remain calm. "Whatever debts his pack owed, he didn't incur them. He doesn't deserve to suffer for the failures of adults." "The supernatural world is not governed by concepts of deserving," Ravin replied, though something in his expression suggested that Eyris' reaction was not entirely unexpected. "It operates according to power, debt, and the ability to protect what you value." "Then protect him," Eyris said, surprising himself with his boldness. "You have the power to keep him safe. Use it to do something good instead of profitable." For a long moment, Ravin studied Eyris' face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. The vampire's dark eyes seemed to look straight through to his soul, evaluating not just his words, but the genuine conviction behind them. "Interesting," Ravin murmured finally. "You would risk my displeasure to advocate for a stranger's child?" "I would risk anything to protect an innocent life," Eyris replied without hesitation. "That's not weakness, that's strength. The kind of strength that builds something worthwhile instead of just accumulating power for its own sake." Something shifted in Ravin's expression at those words, a change too subtle to identify but profound enough to alter the entire dynamic between them. "Very well," he said quietly. "The boy may stay, but he becomes your responsibility entirely. His care, his education, his behavior, all of it falls on you. If he becomes a problem, you will both answer for it." "Thank you," Eyris breathed, relief flooding through him so intensely that he felt dizzy with it. "Don't thank me yet," Ravin warned, but there was something almost gentle in his tone. Caring for a traumatized child while adapting to life in a vampire's household will test you in ways you can't imagine. The integration of Lin into their strange household brought changes that none of them had anticipated. The boy was quiet and well-behaved, grateful for the safety and stability that the manor provided, but his presence added a warmth and energy that had been missing before. He followed Eyris around like a devoted shadow, eager to help with whatever tasks needed doing and hungry for the attention and care he had been denied. More surprisingly, Ravin seemed to develop a genuine fondness for the child. The ancient vampire, who claimed to have no patience for mortal concerns, could often be found teaching Lin to read from his collection of ancient texts, or explaining the properties of various magical artifacts. When the boy had nightmares about whatever trauma had brought him to the dungeons, it was often Ravin who would appear at his bedside with stories of distant lands and legendary heroes that could chase away the darkest dreams. "You're good with him," Eyris observed one evening as they watched Lin practice his letters at the great table in the library. "Children are remarkably resilient," Ravin replied, but there was a softness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "They adapt to new circumstances far more easily than adults, and they accept affection without the complicated emotional baggage that comes with experience and disappointment." "Is that why you agreed to let him stay?" Eyris asked. "Because he's uncomplicated?" Ravin was quiet for a long moment, watching as Lin carefully formed each letter with intense concentration. "I agreed to let him stay," he said finally, "because you asked me to, and because I've discovered that I'm curious to see what kind of man you'll help him become." The words sent a warm flutter through Eyris' chest, a recognition that their relationship had evolved far beyond the simple dynamics of master and servant. There was something building between them, something that went deeper than mere compatibility or mutual convenience, though neither of them had yet found the courage to name it directly. That courage came during a crisis that tested everything they had built together. Word reached the manor that Can and a coalition of alpha packs had discovered Eyris' location and were planning a coordinated assault to reclaim what they viewed as stolen property. The vampire council that governed Ravin's kind had forbidden direct conflict with the werewolf clans, leaving him technically unable to defend his household against the coming attack. "You could just give me back to them," Eyris said quietly as they discussed their limited options in Ravin's study. "Cut your losses and avoid the political complications." "Never," Ravin said immediately, his voice carrying such fierce conviction that the very air around them seemed to heat up with his emotion. "You chose to stay here, chose to make this place your home. I will burn every pack in existence before I let them take you away. But the council's prohibition can be circumvented if I act in defense of my legitimate property," Ravin interrupted. "Though that would require you to formally accept binding to me, becoming mine in the eyes of supernatural law." The implications of what he was suggesting hit Eyris like a physical blow. Accepting such a binding would mean giving up any hope of ever returning to his former life, of ever being accepted back into werewolf society. It would make him Ravin's in a way that went beyond simple employment or even friendship. "And if I refuse?" Eyris asked, though his heart was already providing the answer. "Then I'll fight anyway," Ravin replied simply. "Council prohibition or no council prohibition, I won't stand by and watch them destroy what we've built here." The attack came at dawn, just as the first rays of sunlight were beginning to weaken Ravin's supernatural abilities. Can led the assault personally, bringing with him nearly 50 werewolves in both human and wolf forms. They surrounded the manor with military precision, cutting off all escape routes while their leader stepped forward to make his demands. "Vampire?" Can called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Return my property and we'll consider this matter settled. Refuse, and we'll take him back by force and burn your nest to the ground." "Your property?" Ravin emerged from the manor with the fluid grace that marked his supernatural nature, seemingly unconcerned by the overwhelming odds he faced. "I was under the impression that you had publicly rejected any claim to this particular Omega." "Rejection doesn't void ownership," Ken replied coldly. "He was born to our pack, raised by our resources, trained at our expense. He belongs to us regardless of any personal feelings I might have about his worthiness." "How convenient," Ravin observed, his tone carrying an edge that made several of the attacking wolves step back nervously. "You cast him aside when he proved inconvenient, but now claim ownership when it suits your purposes." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but Lin chose that moment to appear in the manor's doorway, his young face bright with concern as he took in the hostile crowd surrounding their home. "Eyris?" the boy called out, running toward the Omega who had become his guardian and protector. "Are these the bad people who hurt children like me?" The sight of a werewolf child living peacefully in a vampire's household sent ripples of shock through the attacking pack. Many of them had assumed that Eyris was being held prisoner or enslaved, but the obvious affection between him and Lin suggested something far more complex. "You're harboring stolen children now?" Ken demanded, his voice rising with outrage. "How many of our young have you corrupted with your unnatural influence?" "I'm not stolen," Lin said with the directness that only children possessed. "I was hurt and scared, and Eyris saved me. He taught me to read and made me feel safe again. This is my home now." The boy's simple testimony seemed to affect some of the attacking wolves more than any elaborate argument could have. Eyris could see doubt beginning to creep into their expressions as they processed the evidence that their assumptions about the situation might be wrong. But Ken was too committed to his course of action to be swayed by emotional appeals. "Enough," he snarled, his patience clearly exhausted. "I came here to reclaim pack property, not to debate philosophy with bloodsuckers and their pets." The battle that followed was unlike anything Eyris had ever witnessed. Ravin moved with inhuman speed and grace, his supernatural abilities allowing him to hold his own against multiple opponents despite being severely outnumbered. But even his considerable powers had limits, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, his strength began to wane noticeably. It was when one of the attacking alphas broke through Ravin's defenses and landed a blow that sent the vampire crashing into the manor's stone wall. That something awakened inside Eyris. Power that he had never known he possessed suddenly flared to life, filling him with energy that seemed to come from the very core of his being. The healing magic that erupted from him was unlike anything the assembled werewolves had ever seen. Golden light poured from his hands and spread across the battlefield, not just mending wounds but creating barriers of pure energy that protected the innocent and held back those who meant harm. For the first time in his life, Eyris understood what it meant to be powerful, to have abilities that could change the course of events rather than just responding to them. Impossible, Ken breathed, his face pale with shock as he watched his former mate wield magic that shouldn't have existed in any Omega. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. I was never nothing, Eyris replied, his voice carrying new strength and confidence as he helped Ravin to his feet. I was just never allowed to be everything I could become. The sight of an Omega displaying such power sent shockwaves through the attacking pack. Several of them began to retreat, clearly unwilling to continue fighting against forces they didn't understand. Others looked to Can for guidance, but their alpha seemed as stunned as anyone by the revelation of Eyris's true abilities. You see, Ravin said, his voice weak but filled with unmistakable pride as he leaned against Eyris for support. This is what happens when someone is allowed to grow into their true potential instead of being forced to fit into artificial limitations. In the aftermath of the battle, as the surviving attackers retreated to reconsider their assumptions about power and worth, Eyris found himself alone with Ravin in the vampire's private chambers. The ancient being had been more seriously injured than he had initially let on, and it fell to Eyris to provide the healing that could save his life. I need to share my blood with you, Eyris said quietly, understanding instinctively what was required. It's the only way to give you enough strength to heal properly. That would bind us, Ravin warned, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just legally, but spiritually. You would become mine in ways that go beyond any contract or agreement. And you would become mine, Eyris replied, settling beside the vampire and offering his wrist. That's what binding means, isn't it? Mutual belonging, chosen freely rather than imposed by others. The moment Ravin's fangs pierced his skin, Eyris felt something fundamental shift between them. The connection that formed was unlike anything he had experienced with his rejected fated mate, deeper and more intimate than mere genetic compatibility. Through the sharing of blood, he could feel Ravin's emotions as clearly as his own. Desire, yes, but also reverence, protectiveness, and something that might have been love in its truest form. Mine, Ravin whispered against his throat as strength flowed back into his weakened body. My heart, my choice, my beloved. Yours, Eyris agreed, understanding for the first time what it meant to belong to someone who truly valued him. And you're mine, for as long as you'll have me. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, reverent, as if Ravin couldn't quite believe that this beautiful, powerful being had chosen to bind himself to a creature of darkness and blood. But when Eyris responded eagerly, pressing closer and opening his mouth under his, the vampire deepened it with a passion that spoke of centuries of loneliness finally ending. They made love that night with a tenderness that surprised them both, Ravin worshipping Eyris's body with the reverence of someone who had finally found something worth cherishing above all else. Through their blood bond, Eyris could feel every emotion, every thought, every sensation that flowed through his vampire lover, creating an intimacy that went far beyond the merely physical. I have lived for over 1,000 years, Ravin whispered against his ear as they moved together in perfect rhythm. But only with you have I felt that time truly matters, that each moment is precious because it's shared with someone who sees value in what I am rather than just what I can provide. You're not just what you can provide, Eyris replied, arching beneath him as pleasure built to impossible heights. Your home, your safety, you're the first person who ever looked at me and saw strength instead of weakness. In the morning, they woke wrapped around each other like they had been made to fit together, and Eyris felt a completeness he had never known before. This wasn't the desperate pull of a fated bond imposed by genetics and tradition, but something they had chosen freely, something that belonged entirely to them. Their happiness was tested when a delegation arrived from the werewolf clans, representatives who had come to investigate the reports of an Omega displaying unprecedented power while living peacefully among vampires. Leading the group was an elder named Gareth, whose reputation for wisdom and fairness preceded him throughout the supernatural community. "We come not to reclaim or condemn," Gareth announced as he stood before Eyris and Ravin in the manor's great hall, "but to understand. The magic you displayed during the battle has implications that extend far beyond personal relationships or pack politics." "What kind of implications?" Eyris asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that could change how our peoples interact," Gareth replied thoughtfully. "For centuries, we've maintained rigid boundaries between species, convinced that mixing our kinds would lead to weakness and corruption. But you've demonstrated abilities that suggest the opposite might be true." The discussion that followed was intense but respectful, with the elder questioning both Eyris and Ravin about their relationship, their methods of cooperation, and the circumstances that had led to such unexpected developments. What emerged was a picture of partnership that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and compatibility. "You're proposing that we abandon traditions that have served our people for millennia," one of the younger delegates objected when Gareth suggested that formal cooperation between species might be beneficial. "I'm proposing that we examine whether those traditions actually serve us, or whether we serve them," Gareth replied calmly. "This Omega has achieved more in his exile than most alphas accomplish in lifetimes of traditional success. Perhaps it's time to question what we mean by strength and weakness." In the end, the delegation departed with more questions than answers, but also with a commitment to study the implications of what they had witnessed. Some of the younger werewolves expressed interest in visiting the manor to learn more about cross-species cooperation, while others remained skeptical but agreed to withhold judgment until more evidence could be gathered. The real test of their new status came when Ken himself appeared at their door, alone and bearing none of the hostility that had characterized his previous visit. The Alpha looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of leadership, and what Eyris could sense were deep personal regrets. "I didn't come to cause trouble," Ken said immediately when Eyris met him at the gate. "I just wanted to see for myself what you've built here, to understand how someone I dismissed as worthless could become this." "You're welcome here," Eyris said, meaning it despite their complicated history. "Though I should warn you that our household operates according to principles that might challenge some of your assumptions about power and authority." The tour that followed was both painful and illuminating for Ken. He saw a vampire and werewolf living as true equals, sharing responsibilities and decision-making in ways that traditional pack structure declared impossible. He witnessed a child from his own species thriving under the care of beings who should have been natural enemies. Most challengingly, he observed the obvious love and contentment that characterized the relationship between Eyris and Ravin. "I keep thinking about what might have been," Ken confided to Eyris during a private conversation on their second evening. "If I had been brave enough to accept our bond, if I had prioritized connection over social expectations." "Regret is a poison that destroys the present as well as the past," Eyris replied, drawing on wisdom he had gained through his experiences with healing both bodies and spirits. "The question isn't what might have been, but what you're going to do with the knowledge you have now." "What do you mean?" Ken asked, genuine confusion evident in his voice. "I mean that you're still young enough to make different choices," Eyris said gently. "You're still capable of learning to value authenticity over appearances, connection over dominance. The fact that you came here suggests you're already starting that process." When Ken finally departed, he carried with him not just new ideas about leadership and relationships, but a commitment to implementing changes in his own pack. The letters that arrived over the following months described a gradual transformation of traditional policies, with increased tolerance for non-conventional partnerships and greater emphasis on individual merit rather than bloodline status. The success of these changes attracted attention from supernatural communities across the continent, leading to a stream of visitors who came to study their methods and potentially implement similar approaches in their own territories. What had started as a simple household gradually evolved into something unprecedented. A sanctuary where beings from different species could learn to cooperate as equals rather than predator and prey. They established formal programs for education and cultural exchange, creating opportunities for young supernaturals to learn about each other's traditions and perspectives. Lin emerged as one of the most effective teachers in these programs, his mixed experiences and natural empathy making him uniquely qualified to help bridge the gaps between different worldviews. "You've raised him well," Ravin observed one evening as they watched Lin facilitate a discussion between a group of young vampires and werewolves. "He has your compassion, but with a confidence that's entirely his own." "He's raised himself in many ways," Eyris replied, though he couldn't hide his pride in the young man Lin was becoming. "We just provided the environment where he could grow into who he was meant to be." Years passed, and their influence continued to spread far beyond the borders of their estate. Academic institutions began offering courses on interspecies relations based on research conducted at their sanctuary. Progressive leaders cited their example when arguing for policy changes in their own communities. Most importantly, a new generation grew up believing that cooperation between different types of beings was not just possible but natural. On their 5th anniversary as bonded mates, Eyris and Ravin stood together in the garden where they had first shared blood and sealed their connection. The estate around them had been transformed into something that neither of them could have imagined when they first met. A thriving community where love truly had conquered fear and difference was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. "Any regrets about the quiet life we thought we were building?" Ravin asked as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "None," Eyris said immediately, his voice warm with contentment and love. "Though I have to admit, when you first bought me from those slavers, I never imagined it would lead to this." "Nor did I," Ravin admitted, pulling Eyris closer against his side. "I thought I was acquiring a useful servant, perhaps an interesting companion. I had no idea I was meeting the other half of my soul." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps as Lin joined them on the terrace. Now a young man whose mixed heritage had become a bridge between communities rather than a source of shame. In his hands, he carried a silver flute that had been Ravin's anniversary gift to Eyris, an instrument whose music had become legendary for its ability to soothe conflicts and inspire understanding. "Play something," Lin requested, settling on the grass beside them with the easy familiarity of beloved family. "Something that reminds us why we're here." Eyris raised the flute to his lips and began to play a melody that seemed to capture everything they had built together. The pain of rejection transformed into the joy of chosen love, the isolation of exile overcome by the warmth of true family, the fear of difference replaced by the celebration of diversity. The music carried across the valley, and those who heard it paused in their activities to listen, drawn by the promise of harmony that transcended all boundaries. As the last notes faded into the gathering darkness, Eyris felt a profound sense of completion mixed with excitement for what was yet to come. The rejected Omega who had expected to die alone in the wilderness had become a healer not just of bodies but of entire communities, proving that sometimes the greatest strength comes from embracing what others see as weakness. "Once I searched for home in another's acceptance," he said softly, his words carrying to both his beloved vampire and their adopted son. "Now I've grown into my own skin, learned to be complete in myself while sharing that completeness with others." In the distance, the lights of their sanctuary glowed like stars brought down to earth, each one representing a life that had been touched and transformed by the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over fear, acceptance over judgment, hope over despair. Their story had no ending because the best love stories never do, continuing to unfold in the lives of everyone they touched, proving that rejection and exile could become the foundations for something more beautiful than anything that came before. Under the silver light of the moon that had once witnessed Eyris's greatest humiliation, he had found not just love but purpose, not just acceptance but the power to help others find their own paths to belonging. And in the music that flowed from his flute, carried on the night air to touch hearts across the valley, was the promise that love really could conquer all, one choice at a time, one heart at a time, one soul at a time. The first major test of their established sanctuary came 7 years after its founding, when a delegation of elder vampires arrived unannounced at their gates. Unlike the diplomatic visits they had grown accustomed to, this group came bearing the formal seals of the High Council of the Undead, the ancient governing body that had ruled vampire society since before recorded history began. Their leader was Morgana Blackthorn, a vampire so old that she remembered the time when dragons still ruled the earth and magic flowed as freely as water. Her presence carried the weight of millennia, and even Ravin, despite his own considerable age and power, showed her the deference due to one of the founding members of their species. "Ravin Mortis," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that marked vampires of the first generation. "You have been summoned to account for your innovations in interspecies relations. The Council has received numerous reports about your sanctuary that raise questions about your loyalty to our kind." "My loyalty has never wavered," Ravin replied, his tone respectful but firm. "I have simply expanded my understanding of what serves our people's long-term interests." "Have you?" Morgana's ancient eyes fixed on Eyris with an intensity that made the werewolf's skin crawl with unease. "Or have you allowed yourself to be corrupted by attachments that cloud your judgment and compromise your effectiveness as one of our agents?" The revelation that Ravin had been working as an agent for the Vampire Council sent shockwaves through Eyris that he struggled to conceal. Their entire relationship suddenly took on new dimensions as he wondered how much of their connection had been genuine and how much had been calculation or duty. "My personal relationships have enhanced rather than diminished my value to the Council," Ravin said carefully. "The intelligence I've gathered about werewolf society and politics far exceeds anything we've obtained through traditional methods." "Intelligence gathered through seduction and manipulation?" Morgana asked, her tone carrying implications that made Eyris's blood run cold. "How convenient that your assignment to monitor pack activities resulted in such intimate cooperation from their former member." "That's enough," Eyris said quietly, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present, including himself. "Whatever relationship exists between Ravin and your council, it doesn't change what we've built here or the bonds we've forged." "Bonds?" Morgana laughed, the sound like breaking crystal in the night air. "You speak of bonds with a creature whose very nature makes genuine emotional connection impossible? Child, you have been a useful tool, nothing more." The words hit Eyris like physical blows, each one designed to cut at his deepest insecurities about being abandoned and used by those he trusted. Through their blood bond, he could feel Ravin's anguish at seeing him hurt, but also a complexity of emotion that suggested the situation was far more complicated than either of them had realized. "Is it true?" Eyris asked, turning to face the vampire who had become the center of his world. "Was I just an assignment? A convenient source of information about werewolf culture and politics?" "It began that way," Ravin admitted, his honesty cutting through Eyris like a blade even as it demonstrated the trust between them. "The Council assigned me to infiltrate werewolf society, to gather intelligence about their weaknesses and potential threats. When the opportunity arose to acquire a rejected Omega with insider knowledge, it seemed like the perfect cover." "And when did it stop being an assignment?" Eyris pressed, needing to understand the truth even if it destroyed everything he believed about their relationship. "The moment you risked my displeasure to save Lynn," Ravin replied without hesitation. "When you stood in front of me and demanded that I protect a child I had every intention of selling, I realized that you possessed something I had forgotten existed: genuine moral courage. Everything that came after was real, chosen freely rather than calculated for advantage." Morgana watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction, clearly believing that she had successfully driven a wedge between them that would serve the Council's purposes. "How touching," she said with acid sweetness. "But personal feelings are luxuries that agents cannot afford. You will return with us to face judgment for your unauthorized emotional attachments." "No," Eyris said, stepping between Morgana and Ravin with protective instincts that surprised everyone present. "If you want to take him, you'll have to go through me first." "A werewolf protecting a vampire?" One of Morgana's companions laughed with genuine amusement. "How delightfully backwards. Tell me, Omega, what exactly do you think you can do against creatures who were ancient when your species was still learning to walk upright?" Instead of answering with words, Eyris let his power manifest in the way that had become natural to him over the years of healing and protection. Golden light poured from his hands and spread throughout the area, creating barriers of pure energy that made even the ancient vampires step back with expressions of surprise and concern. "I think," Eyris said calmly, his voice carrying new authority, "that you've underestimated what love can accomplish when it's built on truth rather than manipulation." The standoff that followed was tense but brief. Morgana quickly realized that attempting to take Ravin by force would result in a conflict that could devastate both sides and attract unwanted attention from other supernatural authorities. More importantly, she began to see potential value in the unprecedented cooperation that Eyris and Ravin had achieved. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "there are benefits to your unorthodox approach that warrant further study. The Council is always interested in new methods of gathering intelligence and influencing other species." "Our relationship isn't a method," Ravin said firmly. "It's a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. If the Council wishes to benefit from our success, they'll need to accept that it comes from authenticity rather than manipulation." The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days, during which representatives from multiple supernatural communities were called in to assess the implications of what Eyris and Ravin had built. What emerged was not just acceptance of their sanctuary, but formal recognition as a neutral territory where interspecies diplomacy could take place under conditions of safety and mutual respect. "You've created something unprecedented," Morgana admitted as her delegation prepared to depart. "Whether it will prove sustainable in the long term remains to be seen, but the immediate benefits are undeniable." "And Ravin's status with the Council?" Eyris asked, still concerned about potential consequences for his mate's unauthorized emotional attachments. "Has been upgraded from field agent to special ambassador," Morgana replied with something that might have been approval. "His unique insights into cross-species relations have proven too valuable to dismiss, regardless of how they were acquired." The crisis had tested their relationship in ways that neither of them had anticipated, but it had also strengthened the bonds between them by forcing complete honesty about their origins and motivations. That night, as they lay together in their private chambers, Eyris found himself reflecting on how much their love had evolved since those early days of uncertainty and careful boundaries. "Do you regret learning the truth about how we met?" Ravin asked, his fingers tracing patterns on Eyris's bare chest with the familiarity of years of intimate connection. "I regret that you felt you couldn't tell me sooner," Eyris replied honestly. "But I don't regret anything that led us to where we are now. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most complicated beginnings." "You're remarkably forgiving for someone who was essentially deceived for months," Ravin observed, though his tone carried relief rather than surprise. "I wasn't deceived about the things that matter," Eyris said, turning in his arms to look directly into those dark eyes that had become his anchor and his home. "I was deceived about your initial motivations, but not about your capacity for love, your willingness to grow, your commitment to protecting what we've built together." The kiss that followed was deep and passionate, a reaffirmation of bonds that had been tested, but not broken by the revelation of their complex origins. As their bodies joined together with the practiced ease of lovers who knew each other completely, both of them understood that their relationship had entered a new phase, one built on absolute honesty and unconditional acceptance. The changes that followed the Council's recognition rippled through their community in ways both expected and surprising. Official status brought funding and resources that allowed them to expand their programs and accept more refugees from across the supernatural spectrum. But it also brought scrutiny and political pressures that required careful navigation to maintain their core values. Lin, now in his 20s and serving as one of their primary diplomats, proved particularly skilled at managing these challenges. His mixed heritage and upbringing in their inclusive environment made him uniquely qualified to translate between different cultural perspectives and find common ground where others saw only conflict. "You've become quite the politician," Eyris observed one evening as they watched Lin mediate a heated discussion between representatives from 3 different supernatural communities. "I learned from watching both of you," Lin replied, his voice warm with affection for his adoptive parents. "You taught me that the strongest negotiations come from genuine understanding rather than manipulation or force." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, a young vampire named Adrian whose obvious distress immediately attracted Eyris's healer instincts. The newcomer was clearly highborn, his clothes and bearing marking him as nobility, but something had driven him to seek sanctuary despite the social costs of associating with their unconventional community. "Please," Adrian said, his voice breaking with emotion as he approached their group. "I need help. I need somewhere safe to be who I really am without fear of persecution or exile." The story that emerged over the following hours was one that had become heartbreakingly familiar to Eyris over the years. Adrian was the son of a powerful vampire lord who expected him to follow traditional paths of dominance and territorial expansion. But the young vampire's nature ran toward scholarship and healing rather than conquest, making him a disappointment to family who valued strength above all else. More complicated still, Adrian had fallen in love with a werewolf scholar named Marcus, a relationship that violated every tradition and taboo that governed interactions between their species. When their secret had been discovered, both of them had been threatened with execution unless they agreed to permanent separation and exile from their respective communities. "We tried to run away together," Adrian explained, tears streaming down his face as he recounted their desperate flight. "But my father's agents found us 3 days ago. Marcus sacrificed himself to give me time to escape. I don't even know if he's still alive." The pain radiating from the young vampire was so intense that Eyris found himself automatically extending his healing abilities to provide what comfort he could. Through the empathic connection that formed, he could sense the depth of Adrian's love for his missing partner and the genuine terror that Marcus might be dead because of their forbidden relationship. "We'll help you," Eyris said without hesitation, looking to Ravin for confirmation of support he knew would be forthcoming. "And we'll do everything we can to find Marcus and bring him here safely." "You would do that?" Adrian asked, hope beginning to replace despair in his voice. "Risk conflict with both vampire and werewolf nobility for the sake of strangers?" "We would do that because love deserves protection," Ravin replied firmly. "Because every being has the right to choose their own path, regardless of what others expect from them." The rescue mission that followed tested all of the diplomatic connections and resources that their sanctuary had accumulated over the years. Ravin used his contacts within vampire society to locate where Marcus was being held, while Eyris reached out to progressive werewolf leaders who might be willing to intervene on humanitarian grounds. The breakthrough came when they learned that Marcus was being held by the same pack that had once sought to reclaim Eyris, now under new leadership following Ken's gradual transformation toward more inclusive policies. The current alpha, a young female named Sarah who had grown up hearing stories about the Omega who had found power through love rather than dominance, proved receptive to their arguments for mercy. "This Marcus," Sarah said during their clandestine meeting at a neutral territory. "He's the scholar who's been writing about peaceful coexistence between species? I've read his work. It's persuasive. He's also someone's beloved," Eyris added, understanding that emotional appeals might succeed where political arguments failed. "Someone who's currently dying of grief because he believes his mate is dead." The negotiation that followed was complex and delicate, requiring concessions from multiple parties and guarantees that the rescued werewolf would never return to threaten pack security. In the end, Sarah agreed to release Marcus into their custody in exchange for ongoing access to their educational programs and a formal treaty of non-aggression between their territories. The reunion between Adrian and Marcus was so emotionally intense that even the hardened diplomats who had arranged it found themselves moved to tears. The love between the vampire and werewolf was obvious and genuine, a perfect example of the kind of cross-species bonding that their sanctuary had been created to protect and nurture. "How can we ever repay you?" Marcus asked as he recovered from his ordeal in the sanctuary's medical facilities. "You risked everything to save someone you'd never met. You can repay us by living freely and happily," Eyris replied, "by proving that love really can transcend the boundaries that others try to impose on it." The success of Adrian and Marcus's rescue became legendary throughout the supernatural community, inspiring other couples to seek refuge at their sanctuary and encouraging progressive leaders to reconsider their policies toward cross-species relationships. But it also attracted the attention of conservative factions who viewed their growing influence as a threat to traditional power structures. The backlash came in the form of the Alliance of Pure Blood, a coalition of extremist groups from multiple species who shared a commitment to maintaining rigid separation between supernatural communities. Their leader was an ancient dragon named Malakar, whose hatred of mixing between species was matched only by his political cunning and ruthless determination to achieve his goals. "You have become a cancer on the natural order," Malakar declared in a formal message delivered to their sanctuary. "Your corruption spreads like a disease, weakening the pure bloodlines that have maintained stability for millennia. This will not be tolerated." The threat was not subtle, and within days they began to see evidence of coordinated harassment directed at their residents and allies. Supply shipments were intercepted, communications were disrupted, and several of their diplomatic contacts reported pressure to sever their relationships with the sanctuary. "They're trying to isolate us," Ravin observed as they reviewed the pattern of interference during an emergency council meeting. "Cut us off from resources and allies until we're vulnerable enough to attack directly. Then we need to show them that we're not as vulnerable as they believe," Eyris replied, his strategic thinking having developed considerably over the years of leading their community. "And that attacking us will cost them more than they're willing to pay." The plan they developed was ambitious and dangerous, but it represented their best hope of countering the Alliance's pressure campaign. Instead of waiting passively for the attacks to escalate, they would take the initiative by organizing a grand conference that would bring together progressive leaders from across the supernatural world. The gathering would serve multiple purposes: demonstrating the breadth and strength of their support network, providing a forum for developing coordinated responses to extremist threats, and most importantly, showing that their vision of interspecies cooperation had grown beyond a single sanctuary to become a genuine movement for social change. "It's a risk," Lynn observed as they finalized the invitation list. "Bringing so many important figures together in one place makes them all targets for anyone who wants to strike a devastating blow against progressive policies." "Everything worthwhile involves risk," Eyris replied, his voice carrying the confidence that had grown through years of successful leadership. "The question is whether the potential benefits justify the dangers." The response to their invitations exceeded their most optimistic projections. Representatives from dozens of supernatural communities confirmed their attendance, including several heads of state who had never before participated in interspecies diplomatic events. Even some moderate members of traditionalist factions expressed interest in observing the proceedings, suggesting that the extremist alliance's pressure tactics had pushed fence-sitters toward more open-minded positions. The week leading up to the conference was a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Security arrangements required coordination with friendly military forces from multiple species. Accommodation had to be arranged for delegates whose physiological needs ranged from regular blood meals to specialized environmental controls. Most challenging of all, protocols had to be developed for managing diplomatic interactions between groups that had been enemies for centuries. "I never imagined when I first found you in those woods that it would lead to something like this," Ravin observed the night before the conference was scheduled to begin. They stood together on the balcony of their private chambers, looking out over a sanctuary that had been transformed into a temporary capital of supernatural diplomacy. "Neither did I," Eyris admitted, leaning into the familiar comfort of his mate's embrace. "But perhaps that's the beauty of love, the way it expands beyond anything we thought we wanted or needed until we find ourselves living lives we never dared to dream." The conference itself exceeded even their ambitious hopes for success. Sessions on trade cooperation led to agreements that would benefit multiple communities economically. Workshops on conflict resolution provided tools that could be applied to long-standing territorial disputes. Most importantly, personal connections formed between delegates who had previously known each other only as names on formal documents or historical enemies. The breakthrough moment came during a panel discussion on cross-species relationships, when Adrian and Marcus shared their story with an audience that included many of the leaders who had the power to change policies in their home territories. The young couple's obvious love and genuine happiness challenged stereotypes and assumptions in ways that no amount of political argument could have achieved. "Love is not weakness," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of speaking before such an influential audience. "It's the greatest strength any being can possess, because it motivates us to become better than we are alone." The alliance would have you believe that mixing between species leads to corruption and decay, Marcus added, his scholarly training evident in the careful structure of his argument. But we are living proof that it leads to growth, understanding, and the kind of strength that comes from unity rather than isolation. The standing ovation that followed their presentation seemed to mark a turning point not just in the conference but in the broader struggle between progressive and traditionalist factions. When the formal votes were taken on various proposals for increased cooperation, the margins of victory were larger than anyone had predicted. But their success had not gone unnoticed by their enemies. On the final night of the conference, as delegates were preparing to return to their home territories with news of what had been accomplished, the Alliance of Pure Blood launched their long-planned assault on the sanctuary. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, with forces positioned to cut off escape routes and prevent outside intervention. Malachar himself led the assault, his ancient draconic power making him a formidable opponent even for the combined defensive capabilities of their security forces. Surrender the corruption at the heart of this abomination, the dragon demanded, his voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural amplification. Give us the vampire and his pet Omega, and the rest may live to reconsider their allegiances. Never, Eyris replied, his own voice somehow carrying just as clearly despite his lack of draconic vocal cords. We stand together or we fall together, but we will never surrender to those who would destroy love in the name of purity. The battle that followed was unlike anything the supernatural world had witnessed in centuries. Progressive delegates fought alongside their former enemies against the extremist forces that threatened everything they had worked to build. Ancient magic clashed with modern tactics as beings who had never before cooperated learned to coordinate their efforts in real time. At the center of it all, Eyris found himself wielding power that even he had never suspected he possessed. The golden light that had first manifested during his confrontation with can now blazed like a miniature sun, providing healing and protection for their defenders while creating barriers that even Malachar's draconic fire could not penetrate. Impossible! The ancient dragon snarled as his most devastating attacks were turned aside by barriers of pure healing energy. You are nothing but a rejected Omega, a cast-off who should have died forgotten in the wilderness. I was never nothing, Eyris replied, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had finally understood his own worth. I was just never allowed to become everything I was meant to be. The tide of battle turned when Ravin and several other vampire nobles managed to breach the Alliance's coordination center, disrupting their command structure and creating chaos in their ranks. With their carefully planned assault falling apart, many of the extremist forces began to retreat rather than risk capture or destruction. Malachar himself fought on until the very end, his pride and hatred making surrender impossible even in the face of inevitable defeat. When he finally fell, brought down by the combined efforts of a dozen different species working in perfect coordination, his death marked not just the end of the battle, but the beginning of a new era in supernatural relations. In the aftermath of their victory, as delegates prepared to return home with even more dramatic stories than they had expected to tell, Eyris and Ravin found themselves alone in their garden for the first time in weeks. The sanctuary around them showed the scars of battle, but also the evidence of unprecedented cooperation between former enemies. We've won something important here, Ravin observed, his arms wrapped around Eyris as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Not just a military victory, but proof that our vision of the future is achievable. We've won the right to continue building, Eyris replied, his voice warm with satisfaction and hope. The right to show others that love really can conquer fear, that understanding can overcome prejudice, that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lin, now recognized as one of the most effective diplomats of his generation, accompanied by Adrian and Marcus, whose love story had become a symbol of everything their movement represented. The delegates are requesting a formal ceremony before they depart, Lin reported, his young face glowing with pride and excitement. They want to witness the renewal of your bond vows, to carry the story of your love back to their home territories as proof that what we're building here is real and lasting. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the supernatural world had ever seen. Representatives from dozens of species stood together as witnesses while Eyris and Ravin reaffirmed their commitment to each other and to the principles that had guided their relationship from the beginning. "I choose you," Eyris said, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembled crowd. "Not because fate decreed it, not because duty demanded it, but because you have shown me what it means to be valued for who I am rather than what others expect me to be." "I choose you," Ravin replied, his own voice thick with emotion as he looked into the eyes of the being who had transformed his existence from mere survival into genuine life. "Because you taught me that strength comes not from dominating others but from lifting them up, not from isolation but from connection, not from fear but from love." As they sealed their renewed vows with a kiss that was witnessed by beings from across the supernatural spectrum, Eyris felt a profound sense of completion mixed with excitement for what was yet to come. The rejected Omega who had expected to die alone in the wilderness had become not just a mate and father but a leader whose influence would reshape the world for generations to come. Years would pass, and their love story would become legend, but in that moment, surrounded by friends and allies who had risked everything to defend the right to love freely, they were simply two beings who had chosen each other and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. And in the music that would flow from Eyris's silver flute that evening, carried on the wind to touch hearts across the continent, was the eternal promise that love would always find a way to triumph over hatred, understanding over ignorance, hope over despair. Their legacy lived not just in the sanctuary they had built or the policies they had changed, but in every couple who found courage to love across forbidden boundaries, in every family built on choice rather than biology, in every community that chose inclusion over purity. They had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding suffering but from transforming it into something that serves a purpose greater than individual happiness, creating ripples of change that would continue long after their own story had become part of history.